Hey guys, today I want to talk about something a little both bit dark but also kind of hopeful. Um, I want to talk a little bit about the name, Schizoid Angst. Not so much where the name came from, but what it represents. I also want to talk about the antithesis to what that angst is, the goal, what it is I'm essentially striving for both myself as well as others that might feel similarly. I know for many of you, you don't have a lot of rage like I do. Some of you are just a lot sadder, quieter. Some of you are far more numb to everything. Some less so. Kind of varies, right? Though we all have a very similar sort of personality type. We all are quite diverse in our thinking. We're quite diverse in our priorities, our emotional range or lack thereof. All those things are very different from person to person. But even from those that don't get all that angry, not because it's usually not because they don't internally feel frustrated or furious about their existence, but because they seem to be incapable of producing any kind of external results that would be considered anger, fury, whatever. So some of those people like to see me get angry for those reasons because anger is something I can do quite quite easily, um, which is not always a healthy thing. So to begin with, I want to talk about where that anger stems from, what perpetuates it, and what I'm working toward. I guess the mindset or the place I would like to be in the near future, hopefully. It won't take me more than a decade. That's the hope. Who knows, right? For some of you, it'll take a lot less time. For others, a lot more. I don't know. In any case, as I've talked about before, much of the confusion that comes with being schizoid and living with such a disorder type, whatever, is that you grew up in a world in which you are emotionally and socially disconnected. Thus, you learned to interpret and adapt to that world in a much different fashion than most human beings had to or did. That's much of where a lot of this angst comes from. Growing up in a world that doesn't seem to make sense to you, or that you can make intellectual sense out of, and the more you do so, the less it makes sense on that plane. If you use the rational mind to try to make some sense of the world we inhabit, the sentience that we perceive our universe through, the less it often makes sense. At least the actions that your fellow human beings take against or for one another, oftentimes taking the shape of what seems to be the flailing of arms and the crunching of jowls and things of that nature. And so to us, much of it seems like chaos. Much of it seems to be unsettling and unmanageable, to say the least. Human behavior feels confusing, um, without control or discipline, chaotic, if you will. And we try our best to adapt to such an existence because there is no other choice. So we try our best to understand much of what motivates other human beings, and why they do what they do, and try to understand it on an intellectual level, like a study, or to adapt to survive. This is not a thing that is fun. This is not a thing that is made or makes us feel superior, though many fall into that trap. It is a thing that makes us feel alone, confused, angry, sad, frustrated, depressed, a large array of negative things. And stack on top of that, that we can't quite process all those feelings. Any significant or intense version of any of the things I described usually manifests into extreme discomfort or anxiety, of which it's very difficult to pinpoint source, except for that it's being caused by, or we interpret it as being caused by, external forces, meaning people. So, beginning, especially, I believe, in high school, you start realizing this more. You start realizing that all you're doing is mimicking the human beings around you in an attempt to be one of them, to go with the flow. But when you realize that everyone else isn't merely going through an algorithm, a certain pattern, you have an existential freakout because you thought everyone else was doing this. And when it gets pointed out that no, everyone else is doing this on an intuitive level, no one's attempting to actually mimic things. No one is merely trying to adapt to constantly changing or confusing situations. No, they are adapting, generally speaking, in kind of an intuitive fashion. A set of behaviors that they kind of align themselves with. Irrational motivations that seem to make sense in their mind as a given, as a truism of reality. Things that to the schizoid feel like arbitrary distinctions, arbitrary choices being made without any particularly good reason. Even if you think about it on a, evolutionary or adaptive sort of survival scale, much of what exists now pertaining to human behavior seems to run contrary to perpetuating species. Perhaps at one point those things did help reproductive success and things of that nature, but they no longer seem to function that way, especially since our technology and our philosophical understanding, our culture, has attempted to at least extend itself far beyond the reach of our genetic dispositions or evolutionary psychology. For the schizoid, this is especially frustrating because we're already off on the wrong foot. We live a life in which everything we learned, everything we understood, was done through a intellectual lens, because not because we're big brains, but because that's all we really had. Whatever portion of ourselves were emotionally connected to the external world, which in turn obviously would extend to the social world, the social connections that people make for emotional reasons, which we are, again, unable to do very well. We then have only these faculties, our brain, and the non-emotional capacities are then relied upon. They become a crutch. So we study and we study, we learn, all the while being emotionally disconnected from those very studies. So yes, we become, many of us, well-rounded in our knowledge, but unfortunately is a knowledge that is emotionally useless to us most days. We aren't really motivated or inspired by it. If anything, it probably inspires further negative symptoms such as anhedonia, feelings of abolition, a sort of, as I like to refer to it, cognitive dysphoria seems to occur. The brain we possess and the thought patterns we developed do not coincide. So some aspect of our brain is telling us we need other people. We need a partner. We do not want to be alone. But the intellectual portion in which we have relied on so dearly is telling us why. That doesn't make sense. People only bring misery. People only bring pain and confusion. When you try to connect to people, it fails continuously. So what? Is this not insanity? And that's how it feels. It feels as many have described insanity. Continuation of a goal that is seemingly cannot be accomplished using the only means available. And when the means you have available are incongruent with your ability to achieve those goals, you begin to feel quite insane. Right? And the problem is, as well, is that your intellect or your rational brain is going, this doesn't make sense. I'm doing everything in my power to make things function properly. And it keeps failing. And I keep failing because I am not able to act what would seemingly, or what we would intellectualize as acting irrationally, which is acting through emotional capacity, through emotional means, empathy and sympathy. We then, many of us, develop a cognitive empathy, a strong one, in which we can understand discomfort and suffering, and then we think about our own discomfort and suffering, and we apply it to external forces, and then we are then capable of saying, hey, that thing happening to that person is bad. But it is not emotional empathy. It's quite different. That is something that comes intuitively to many, something we do not generally develop very well. That is not to say that we do not possess a significant amount of emotions. They're all in there. They're very powerful. But most of the time, we can't quite translate them into anything that we can display externally. In my case, it's usually frustration and anger. Those are the only ways I can easily express my internal emotions. The deep stuff. Not the shallow jokes, not the ha-has. But I am learning slowly but surely to externalize positive emotions, which is a difficult task. Misery, frustration come quite easy to me. And I honestly sympathize for those who cannot achieve that goal. Not even that goal of anger and wanting to display it. Now, what happens, in my opinion, is when you can't display those things, when you are faced with a world that doesn't make too much sense, and you also possess a brain that does not allow you to access your internal emotions in a manner in which you can translate it into the external world and facilitate your navigation of that world that already makes little sense to you in a more efficient fashion. The frustration you feel starts creeping in. The parts of you that you manufactured for the purposes of adaptation, parts of you that perhaps are sincerely whatever it is that you are, everything. And you turn into this amalgamation of pieces, some of which belong in the internal, some of which belong exclusively externally, some of which have no home at all. Many times we're unable to differentiate between them, because the sense of self is generally created in the human being via, or at least in some respects, social and emotional connections to the self and how those connections connect to the external. Without those connections, and living in a world that requires them, you do not develop a proper sense of self, that can function in the framework of the external. So thus, you resentment builds up, frustration, the anger, the hatred, because you can't seem to function. And the more you attempt to, the less it seems to work. You end up alone, yet you want to be alone, yet you do not. Why? What is this cognitive dysphoria? What is your brain doing, telling you that you want these things that you do not want on an intellectual level? Or the rational part of your brain cannot connect with the emotional. Thus, you are left at a standstill, at a stalemate, one that creates nothing but madness, hatred, sadness, desperation. But even those things, for many of us, are beyond reach. I am lucky in the sense that my anger is not beyond reach. It is easily accessible. My frustration, my suffering is always within grasp. I cannot say the same for other schizoids. I cannot imagine how maddeningly frustrating it must be to not be able to express anything in any capacity that would reflect your internal conflicts. This leads us to oftentimes create these web of rationalistic lies, intellectualized lies about ourselves and the external world around us. Sometimes we dehumanize what we are, or dehumanize the individuals around us for the purposes of coping. A defense mechanism, if you will. The contradiction, feeling a void, a pit of self, an inability to intellectualize it in any capacity that is satisfying or relieving. So you go day to day, the pains of existence, without finding anything to alleviate it. As most human beings have the capacity to merely alleviate it through an external means. Frustration and stress can be released by most people. Some respect or another. The healthiest way is usually via activities that are enjoyable or pleasant or pleasurable, that relieves stress, decreases frustration and sense of resentment. But for many of us, that is not a possibility, or those possibilities are stunted. So when we attempt them, we end up with an empty hand and what seems to be like a false hope. I'm doing everything in my power at the moment to not display too much of my anger, as it is not useful, at least in this particular instance. That is for a different video. This particular conversation, ramble, whatever you want to call it, because it feels as if I'm just having conversations with myself on a continuous basis. I'm sure you know what that feels like. I want to attempt to also help relate those who cannot display the anger that they internally feel, the hatred for the external world that they feel internally. So out of respect for people that cannot achieve such a goal, I am attempting to quell my own rage. In any case, that is the darkness of the schizoid. That is the deep and deep resentment and frustration for their own existence and the existence of others, and their inability to connect. Sorry, I had to edit a little bit because I was getting really angry. Calm down. Namaste. It's ridiculous. Okay. Step 2. The antithesis. What is it that I want to achieve here for myself and others? For those that feel this anger and this frustration and this madness that I describe. Whatever form it takes. For some of us, it's desperate, struggling sadness. For others, it's, unbound fury. And for others still is a clawing of a black wall on a void where nothing can be felt and numbness is only there. It varies. We all get a little bit of it, some regard or another. But this is what I want to move on to. The white pill, half of this. So I hope if you stayed with me, you don't leave. Stick around. It gets better. There's Cozy Peepo. Cozy Peepo. Okay. So this is what I think to be kind of the antithesis or whatever to that angst, that frustration. And what I'm trying to attempt to build. And what I'm trying to do. Okay? All right. So, via this channel, via this server associated to this channel where other schizoids can gather and communicate, essentially I'm trying to help with, the efforts of others, create like a pocket dimension in which schizoids can gather and manufacture essentially a world, a mini, like I said, a pocket dimension in which we can enjoy ourselves without a lot of these social and emotional preoccupations, without worrying about a lot of those things. I won't go into that because I've done it before. And that, I believe, is the first step away from this angst, this existential dread for some. Because you'll find others suffering similarly to yourself. And in that conjoined suffering and understanding, you find a sense of alleviation. You find a sense of peace. The part of your brain that causes this cognitive dysphoria, as I describe it, that this contradiction of wanting to be isolated and yet not wanting to feel completely alone. This contradiction can be alleviated in such a place because you can communicate with others that might understand or relate to you to varying degrees without any of the hang-ups. There's no requirements to be friends. There's no obligations to stay. None of those things exist on my server. And I try my best to not let those things exist on the stream as well. when I have people that, patrons and stuff that jump on and like to talk and everything. Oddly enough, that also creates an environment in which human connection flourishes, but not social connection as we understand it, as we understood it about most of human history. No, it's something else entirely different. And that difference I've yet to fully comprehend, but it seems to develop in such an environment. And because of those freedoms, that sense of liberation, we can grow. We can actually expand that emotional range, not through force, not through mere exposure, but through motivation, through a sense of tranquility, peace. Why it occurs that way, I'm not entirely sure. But that leads to something else, which is the peace that I think that most schizoids consistently seek. The goal in all this, that which would alleviate the angst and hatred and the sadness, and help progressively remove or improve significantly the negative symptoms associated with this PD. I believe that much of what triggers this resentment and Hedonian evolution is not entirely chemical. I believe that much of it has to do with this frustration I already described, this inability to connect to the external world. And this little pocket dimension, I guess it's something that you can connect to without any obligation or responsibility to do so. A place where the schizoids that need to feel safe can feel safe, and the ones that want to be understood can be understood. It is no paradise, no utopia. Such things do not exist, but it is a much more hospitable environment for people like ourselves. I believe that through such actions, through this form of highly individualistic community, it's not much of a collective, I'll tell you that, something grows, something develops that is long forgotten or never developed or highly underdeveloped inside of the schizoid mind. It's so difficult to not talk about this and get wholesome in some regard, because it actually brings me a feeling of joy, a good feeling, if you will, something that has eluded me most of my life, except in the case of my beautiful wife and children. My experiences with the external world have been negative, confusing, and frustrating. I would say the vast majority of my life. I can't say the same for everyone else listening, but I'm sure you can relate to some degree. So, what would the opposite of Zoid or Schizoid Angst be? What would be the opposite of that? What can be achieved? I cannot promise anything. And I can definitely not promise you, regardless of your efforts and you're continuing down this more positive path, you're going to be happy. Such a promise or such a venture would be folly, in my opinion, but that's just my opinion. No. What I strive for is tranquility, a sense of peace combined with a sense of resignation. But just to feel cozy with the world, as confusing and as maddening as it can be. to feel cozy and wrapping yourself around one very important truth, that though you are somewhat odd and the way you interpret and perceive the world does not fall in line and very well with the frameworks built around you, you can wrap yourself in the idea of understanding you are not the only one. You are not Tigger. You are not the only one. So while there's a ton of poos and piglets and so on and forth in the world, you are something, some amalgamation of Eeyore and Tigger and Rabbit. Whatever it is you are. Even if you're none of those things. Even if you're some creature, Christopher Robin's forest, that no one has ever perceived or was ever even capable of discerning as existing around them, a color out of space, if you will. Just know that there are many other colors out of space there with you. There are many other creatures in the woods that you can cozy yourself up to figuratively. Most of us don't like being touched by others. But you can wrap yourself in that cozy blanket. Because if the internet has brought us something for the schizoid, is the ability to find other ones. Something that perhaps historical schizoids would have had a difficult time attempting to do or attempting to find. And I think that peace of mind, is the antithesis to the anger and the frustration of the schizoid. Because knowing that, just knowing that fact, I think allows you to start realizing how special you guys all really are. To both me and to each other. And I'm not saying like, oh, we're all friends, whatever. Because it's just gross. But we are comrades at arms. We are holed down in the trenches that is the schizoid mind, I guess. And though the bombardments continue, we'll have our cans of spam and our jokes and our laughter. Well, at least some of us. For some of us, that's hard, right? So I'm not gonna say that. In any case, by honing in on this, by wrapping ourselves in this cozy blanket, we can protect ourselves not from the external world, for we have no choice but to interact with it, but from the desperation and the resentment that comes with dealing with it. When you have a partner at your side, when you have comrades at arms, your morale is significantly boosted. And in this would feel almost like a psychological war. You have those around you ready to pick you up, ready to drag you back to clinic so that you can patch yourself up. Because you don't want them patching you up. So yeah. I think that is what can alleviate the resentment and anger, is that notion. And I want to spread this reality because it's not just my opinion. The the fact that there are other schizoids that endure these similar frustrations, anger in the world, and that you are not alone is objectively true, even on an intellectual level. So even if you don't want to think about that on an emotional capacity, you just have to realize there are others. And though I'm sure many of us don't really want to go out and be friends, including me, just knowing that is good enough. It's existentially satisfying. And if that's not enough for you, come to the server. Come talk to us. Talk to me. Talk to whoever you want on there. And learn what it's like to communicate without all the apprehensions that come with conventional social interaction. Flourish. Grow. Find yourself. And be at peace with that notion. To be honest, I'm not sure if I'm making any sense, but it makes sense in here. If you like the stuff I talk about and you think this is something you want to hear more of, they won't all be like this. I'll get into more specific subjects in the future. Just I felt like this was something important to talk about, like to talk about what exists out there to alleviate that sense of frustration. Um, but in any case, if you like what I do and you like my ramblings, please think about Patreon. You already waste your money on other things you don't care about. Just add me to the list of things that you probably don't care about that you can throw money at. And PayPal and all that stuff. Bitcoin, Litecoin, if you're into that sort of thing. It's all listed under the video. At least it should be. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.